Carbone from Rossi-Doria Center, and my task today is very easy, actually, just to coordinate persons who are going to speak. So I suddenly start giving the floor to Valeria Costantini, Director of the Department of Economics here in Roma Tre University. Valeria.
Good afternoon to everybody here. Thank you very much for joining this wonderful event organized by Centro di Eccellenza Rossi-Doria, which is a center working a lot on the topics that are partly covered by the lecture of today. And it is a particular honor for me to be here and to represent the department, provided that I am one intensive user of the GTAL model that was developed by Professor Hertel during the last decade. So thank you very much for being here. And a special thanks also from the students and the PhD students that used and still use the model for their research activities. It is also a pleasure to welcome this host here today, provided that we have a lot of undergraduate and postgraduate courses and also a PhD course in economics here, using and applying research activities related to the topic covered by the lecture today. So again, it's really a nice event and a joy to see these persons here. And I hope also that everyone would encourage the discussion after the lecture. Thank you again for being here and for organizing this event from the department.
Thanks, Valeria. Now, welcome address from Professor Fabiani, which is President of the Rossi-Doria Center. Guido.
Grazie. Buon pomeriggio a tutte e tutti. Grazie per la vostra presenza oggi. Io voglio prima di tutto ringraziare la professoressa Valeria Costantini, direttrice del Dipartimento di Economia, per la sua presenza qui e per il suo discorso di saluto. I am very happy to give Professor Thomas Hertel a warm welcome on behalf of all us. Your lecture, Professor Hertel, evidence-based policy, economic models, data and research institutions to tackle future challenges, is very consistent with one of our main activities, the School of Public Policy Impact Assessment. Many thanks, Professor Hertel. The Rossi-Doria Center is honored to have you as a guest today. Thanks a lot. Quella di oggi è la 25ª lecture tenuta nel tempo dal Centro Rossi-Doria. Scusate la mia voce, ma ho qualche problema di corde vocali. Del tempo, diciamo così, tenuta nel tempo dal Centro Rossi-Doria, che prima era Associazione Manlio Rossi-Doria. Le varie lectures, tutte di alto profilo scientifico e culturale, hanno segnato la nostra storia e raccontando e approfondendo tematiche economiche e sociali del mondo contemporaneo, hanno stimolato le nostre attività di ricerca, le nostre attività di formazione, le nostre attività editoriali. Crediamo che, riportando ad oggi l'insegnamento di Manlio Rossi-Doria e impegnando tanti giovani e promettenti ricercatori, noi abbiamo prodotto come centro un patrimonio di conoscenza su varie tematiche, sul commercio internazionale e sulle politiche commerciali, sulle catene globali del valore, sull'innovazione, sullo sviluppo regionale e sulle politiche dell'Unione Europea, sulla valutazione dell'impatto delle politiche pubbliche, agricoltura, sicurezza alimentare, sostenibilità, energia verde. Tutto questo, voglio dire, si è potuto fare creando una fitta rete di rapporti interni a Roma 3 e con ricercatori di altre università e di prestigiose istituzioni di carattere nazionale ed internazionale. Una rete per noi assolutamente essenziale che vogliamo mantenere e ancora ampliare. Non prenderò altro tempo. Io voglio solo affermare qui che noi crediamo di aver avviato insieme a tanti una bella storia e il nostro intento è quello di continuare ed oggi è un segno in questa direzione e perciò ancora grazie al professor Hertel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Fabiani. And now Luca Salvatici, professor in economics here in Roma 3 University, who has worked for very long with Tom Hertel, is going to introduce Professor Hertel, his work and the lecture.
Thanks, Anna. As you have noticed, the title of this lecture is very long. I don't know if it's the longest in 25 editions, but this makes the top 3 for sure. So I think that I will use a few minutes just to explain why we thought in the board of the Centro Rossi-Doria that Tom Hertel would have been up to the task of such a tall order. Let me start with a fable. So, once upon a time, not so long ago, some people in this room still remember this time, global simulations were very, very rare. So rare that the figures on one hand would have been more than enough to count the few most international institutions, places that have the data and the computing power to perform this type of analysis. Then a man came, his name is Tom Hertel, and everything changed. So today, thousands, literally thousands, is not a figure of speech, of scholars are able to run complex simulation on their laptops. Today, already at the master level, students at Roma 3 use these models as a learning tool. Such a dramatic change has certainly been made possible by technological innovation. The PC hardware, I mean, this computer today on our table a few decades ago were just the size of half of this room. But institutional innovation, which is in the title, also played a major role. 2 points, the decision to make the model and the data as club goods accessible with a reasonable fee, and of course they are no rival in their use, and the intuition about the power of networking in a period where the digital aid connection wasn't really so common. And the approach that if you don't like, if you miss something in the model or in the data, you can fix it or integrate it and then it's shared with the others. Looking at the results obtained by the Global Trade Analysis Project Center, created by Tom Hertel in Purdue, just came to my mind the famous quote, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." It's a bit rhetoric, but just think about what happened. I think that this is a mark of geniality, to make look something trivial that just before wasn't even thinkable. And I think that this is what happened in this case. In the Centro Rossi-Doria, we have a dream. We like to think that when we choose a speaker for the lecture, there is something of the spirit of Rossi-Doria that takes place in the lecture. And I think that the name of Tom Hertel is associated with the Global Trade Analysis Project Center, but the mark in this case is the combination between thorough, careful rigorous theoretical analysis, and careful, serious, sound-based analysis using data. And this is something that those of you that know Rossi-Doria know very well, that it was the core of his message. The project, the GITA project, has been instrumental in improving, if not the quality of policy making, at least the quality of the policy debate, providing evidence-based results, improving the human capital of scores of practitioners, allowing more effective participation, especially by developing countries, in international negotiation. The Centro Rossi-Doria itself has used the model to perform analysis that has been used by the Italian government and by the EU Commission for trade negotiation. This is the core of the message of Rossi-Doria and was at the center of the activity of the Centro di Specializzazione that he created in Portici. Since 1996, l'Associazione per Studi e Ricerche and then Centro Ricerche Economiche e Sociali have worked relentlessly to keep this dream of scientifically rigorous and socially relevant economic analysis alive. And I think that the numerous accomplishments of Tom Hertel are very much in line with this vision. By the way, I'm not going to list all the accomplishments of Tom, because this would take the time for the lecture. If you want, you can easily download his CV, 51 pages, perhaps it's the shortened version, and go through it. Where there is light, there is shadow. Someone could be worried about the consequences of lowering the barriers to access models and data. A colleague once told me that allowing everyone to run simulations by simply pushing a button was as dangerous as putting loaded guns in the hands of children. Indeed, it is well known that a wealth of information may mean a dearth of something else. And we are familiar with what happened during the recent pandemic when the scientific evidence at times was overwhelmed by fake news on the net. However, there is no point in being nostalgic about the good old times. Economics is a science not because it provides a single solution to problems, but because it's able to explain what are the sources of the differences in the results obtained by models based on different assumptions and different data. Tom Hertel greatly contributed, and is contributing still, to this. Thanks to his work, together with the general improvement in software and technology, the transparency of the simulation model has greatly improved. You may not trust the results you get from the simulation, but if you are competent and sometimes stubborn enough, it's always possible to find out where they come from. In other terms, today isn't true anymore the traditional allegation that CG models are black boxes. This is possibly the most relevant among the many achievements of Tom Hertel. I remember a presentation offered at Purdue by David Hummels, a colleague of Tom from the economics department. He compared the evolution over time of Tom's impact factor with those of a bunch of famous economists from the NBR, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the nirvana of American economics. In the graph, all the lines moved following parallel trends. Then the scores obtained by Tom start to rise exponentially. Such a change is not explained by the publication in top-notch economic journals, such as the American Economic Review. It's explained by the publishing in journals with much higher impact factor, such as science, so different domain of science. There is a very important lesson here. Other scientific fields cherish the replicability of the results obtained using models validated by a large community of researchers. Economics, on the other hand, apparently still put a lot of emphasis on originality and appreciates the work of scholars that claim to have used new data and/or new methodologies. This may lead to reinventing the wheel every time, just to convince the referees about the author's ability to perform alone all the stages of the research project: development of the model, data collection, estimation, simulation. In that presentation, David Hummels rightly called this attitude peacocking, pavoneggiarsi. Here is another deep analogy with Rossi-Doria approach. Economics has much to learn from other sciences, both social and experimental sciences. and the multidisciplinary organization of the Centro di Portici, where there were agricultural economics together with economics and statistics, was a pioneering example. I think that there is another recent example where economics is learning from other disciplines, and this is in the counterfactual ex post analysis with quasi-experimental setting. This is another field where we are learning, and this is another field, not by chance, I think, where Centro Rossi-Doria has been a pioneer and is doing a great work, a lot of work in disseminating this type of techniques. But I don't want you to give the impression that today is just a celebration for the past. Just hold on to the second part of Tom's presentation to know what is working on now and what it holds for the future. Let me finish on a personal note. I'm an ordinary economist, but even an average guys can accomplish a lot if they climb on the shoulders of intellectual giants. I was lucky in my professional career to meet several such giants, and some of them are still in this room, but one of them is certainly Tom Hertel. I've never been one of his students, and I never co-authored a paper with him. But I started using GTAP in my PhD dissertation, and I use it for teaching, and I still use it as one of my favorite research tools. It was instrumental in some of what I consider to be my best papers, and the GTAP community has been a source of inspiration and cooperation for several research projects, fruitful research projects over the years. Today, I'm glad to have the opportunity to acknowledge this intellectual debt to Tom, and I wish to thank all the people attending this event in person or virtually. It's been a true privilege to introduce the 25th Rossi-Doria lecture that is going to be presented by Thomas W. Hertel. Thanks.
Thanks, Luca, for introducing Tom Hertel careers, his research commitments, and the topics of the lesson. I think we are ready now for listening to the lesson. Let me just tell the audience, please, to keep questions that may arise while listening the lesson, because we will have the chance to pose to Professor Hertel these questions afterwards. Only a warning to those who are following the lecture on streaming, that they unfortunately will not have the opportunity to pose questions, because it's just a one-way communication. So I'm sorry for this, but we in the room, we will have this privilege. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for the introduction, and Luca especially. Am I coming through okay? Okay. That was a very, very kind introduction. I'm really overwhelmed by that, and I have tremendous respect for Luca, and so I put a lot of value on those kind remarks. And it's an honor to be giving this lecture. I've heard a lot about Professor Rossi-Doria and have a great feeling about the Center Rossi-Doria. So without further ado, let me get into the talk. As he said, Luca and I went back and forth on this title, and I think it reflects the confluence of the interests of Rossi-Doria and my own work. Is this loud enough for you? Okay, well then, can I put this on as well? Yep, okay. Let's try this. How is that? Oops. How is this coming through now? Is it better? Okay, I'll just be a little close to it. Great, well, let me move ahead with this. It's a bit of a retrospective, looking back over 30 years of GTAP activity and related things, and how my own work has evolved, and trying to distill some insights related to evidence-based policymaking. We'll start with trade policy, and then we'll move more into sustainability policies. So I want to first start with this issue of institutional innovation. I think it is key when it comes to this type of research. And my own experience is documented in this book chapter, edited by Peter Dixon and Dale Jorgensen, where I talked a bit about the lay of the land. Luca alluded to that as well, before GTAP. So before GTAP, as he said, there were a few places in the world where you could do this kind of global economic analysis, which was critical for informing international trade negotiations, other issues, where there were such projects, there were either agency-based or university-based, and the agency-based projects typically were designed to be just in time to deliver policy advice for a particular purpose. There was never time to document what was done. So 2 or 3 years of effort was put in place, and then policy advice delivered, and often then all of that work lost because it wasn't documented. In my own case, when I was working with the Australian government on one of these initiatives, I actually sought to use the database to start the GTAP project. The lawyers in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade said, no, what can you give us? If you can't give us something, this is a strategic asset, we won't give you the database. So very frustrating, this agency-based analysis. And of course, unfavorable findings, immediate termination of the project. That one in Australia, focusing on the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation area, the first results they generated were not favorable to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Australia. They killed the whole project. Never really got off the ground. But the researchers did share their work individually, and I was able to rebuild what they did essentially to start GTAP. So agency-based global economic models are problematic. University-based global economic models, on the other hand, have suffered from the fact historically that they didn't have enough contact with policymakers, limited financial support, and in the end, not a lot of incentive to invest in the database. Instead, what you have, you keep hold on to it until you've got the publication, and by then it's probably out of date. So this was the state of affairs when GTAP came along. And so the idea was to have something in between, a publicly funded project, but based in academia. The beautiful thing about academics is we're like elephants. We remember things 1 decade, 2 decades, and that you need that continuity for these projects. So publicly funded project, though, keeps us in connection with the policymakers, with the decision makers. We meet every year with the board of, in this case, 34 leading agencies who then advise on future directions. So this combination has been very effective. We now have 34 consortium members. You can see a map of them. And there are 25,000 people in the network. So, and those people contribute, many of them contribute. Each release of the database has more countries involved. Each country involves months of work to prepare that. So this has been very effective. It's been going and is continuing to grow over 30 years time. And we have this combination of continuity, but policy relevance. Also critical access to information. These public agencies have critical information that is important to integrate into this kind of analysis. So that's been the institutional innovation that has, I think, been key to the success of GTAP. So I just wanted to summarize this and subsequent lessons in just one statement, and I just want to highlight the value of research consortia that combine the benefits of academia with those of policymakers and policymaking institutions, either just in academia or just in public agencies. You know, there are these critical failure points. So I wanted next to turn to capacity building. I think that's really important, and that's been a key element of the GTAP effort. So go all the way back with me to the founding of the WTO in 1995 in the wake of the Uruguay round trade negotiations. So these were trade negotiations held under the auspices of the GATT to form the WTO, to bring agriculture into multilateral disciplines, and in general to make further progress on trade reforms. And so we had this conference at the World Bank, Uruguay Round in the Developing Countries. This is the book that came out of it. Two eminent authors leading it, Will Martin and Alan Winters. And top scholars from around the world were there to present. Let me note that there were none coming from the Global South. No one based in the Global South was presenting there. It was Washington, Paris, Brussels, Geneva, Purdue, a few other, University of Michigan, a few others. So that was a notable limitation given the emphasis on your developing countries here. I want to come back to this point. So this was the first time GTAP was used in a big way. So almost everyone presenting at the conference used the database and used the interpretation of policies, that is the tariff cuts, that were being prepared by the WTO and the World Bank. So we were actually doing the same experiment. Before this, results wildly differed about the gains from this trade reform, a factor of 10 or more. Once we start, and typically authors said, well, my numbers are bigger because I have a better model. You may not be able to use it, but it's better, and I generate bigger numbers. Well, once we all started using the same database and the same policy interpretation, everything converged within 20%. And those few groups that weren't using the GTAP model, a database, they were using the common database, those folks quickly began doing so. So it gave great credibility, but also policy relevance to have these institutions engaged in providing the information. And so the two regions, we did this study in the wake of Uruguay Round, the two regions predicted to lose from Uruguay Round were Africa and the Middle East, and this was not surprising, they weren't really engaged. At this point, I gave this paper in Ethiopia at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. There was some interest, but not capability to follow up on this and become more engaged in trade negotiations at the time. Those who study trade policy realize about this time there was an explosion of regional frustration with the multilateral negotiations led to an explosion of bilateral and regional trade agreements. And here you just see a chart showing how fast they grew during this time. So WTO wasn't delivering. Let's negotiate on our own, perhaps bilaterally. Europe was involved in negotiating partnership agreements at the time. They concluded the first one with South Africa in 1999. And I happened to be there teaching this course, there I am in fact, teaching this course in global economic analysis in Johannesburg, 1998. They were negotiating this agreement. And everyone was leaving in the afternoon, all the South African participants. I said, where are they going? Can't they stay in the class? No, they're negotiating a trade agreement with the EU. And I happen to know some of the EU negotiators, and they came with data and laptops and 20 people preparing their analysis. And here these guys were trying to pick up something in the course they could go over and use in the negotiations. Very asymmetric negotiations. And this was often used, well, the US exploited that power a great deal. I know in the Morocco free trade negotiations, I knew people involved on both sides, and it turns out when Morocco started pushing on a sensitive issue, the US said, well, there's a line of people behind you. If you really want to press on agriculture, maybe go back to the back of the line. So very, not only analysis, but political power, very asymmetric there. This is where the GTAP network was in 2000. Small network, still in the hundreds, and almost no one in Africa. We held a conference to try and remedy this. We held a conference in Addis Ababa in 2006, the UN Economic Commission for Africa. At this point, they were prepared to really engage with us. And they were holding short courses, the conference, and the network was beginning to grow, the Africa one being the orange at the bottom. And this built over the next decade to a very important role for trade policy analysis, GTAP-based analysis, really pioneered by this fellow, Stephen Karingi, Director of Regional Integration at the UNECA. A series of courses, working with individual countries to develop their databases. They really were able to support these negotiations, and the analysis was being done in Africa, in national capitals. It wasn't being done in Rome or in Washington or Brussels. It was being done in Africa. And that made a big difference when it came to concluding the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was signed in 2018. So Stephen Karingi at our conference, the one where David Hummels was speaking in 2017, there was a panel about the impact of GTAP, and Stephen talks about here the value of these tools to design, implementation, and monitoring of reforms on the ground in Africa. So I draw great inspiration from the work that Stephen has done, great inspiration from all of the people that contributed to that. And you can see more than 2,000 members in Africa now in the network. So the key lesson I draw from this, not just the power of networks, but also countries really are not going to engage in meaningful, hard negotiated trade reforms or any kind of policy reform unless they can do the analysis themselves in the national capital, and someone they trust can be doing this work. So this evidence basis for these reforms has to be done locally. Local capacity building is key to that. Okay, let's go beyond GDP. That's where things were kind of at this stage. What are the impacts of trade policy on GDP, national welfare, trade, perhaps employment? And so this was the point at which we started paying more attention to poverty impacts. And I had the opportunity to spend a year at the World Bank leading a project funded by the Dutch government on trade and poverty impacts of the WTO agreement. And I collaborated with Alan Winters, who was the director of research at the time at the World Bank. And we commissioned a dozen studies. I really liked working with Alan. He broadened my horizons. He said, let's use everything, every kind of tool being used, not just CGE analysis, but all kinds of tools. And we worked on a compilation of what we could learn from all these tools about poverty in the WTO. And there was also funding for me and the team to travel around the world and present these findings in key policy arenas. So I wanted to highlight a few of those findings that came out of this. One was on the EU side at the time, there was a lot of opposition to the Doha development proposals because, in particular, they proposed lowering protection on imports from Brazil. And there was the feeling in the European Parliament, all the benefits are just going to go to these big Brazilian farmers. You've seen the pictures of these huge farms, 10,000, 20,000 hectares, just aren't they going to get all the benefits? Well, a detailed study of poverty impacts in Brazil by a team of Brazilians showed that indeed there would be a stimulus to agriculture, but that would stimulate employment, and a lot of the people that they would hire, unskilled workers, come from low-income households. This could lead to overall poverty reduction. When we presented that in Brussels at the time, it was a big surprise. There was very important work done also in Mexico on the transmission of price changes inside a country. So world prices go up for a product, for example, that you're selling. It doesn't get automatically transferred to all the farmers across the country. We know from Italy, a lot of heterogeneity within the country, even more in many developing countries like Mexico. And they documented this within country transmission and the fact that remote households, remote farmers were less likely to benefit. Finally, Alan and I both concluded that really we have to spend more time learning about labor markets, because when it comes to low-income households, what else do they have? They don't own a lot of land. If they did, they would be rich. They don't have a lot of capital. They have their own labor. Even if they're self-employed farmers, it's largely their own labor generating the returns. So more attention to labor markets, and we were talking about that this morning. I don't have time to fully develop it, but it's really gotten my attention, the importance of understanding labor markets if you want to get at poverty impacts. The most important and in a way discouraging for the WTO finding out of this particular project was the conclusion that what was left out of the Doha development agenda was much more significant for poverty reduction than what was included. Here you see a study where the blue bars show poverty reduction across these focal countries if you did all of the reforms that we're talking about. So in agriculture, it's tariff reforms, it involves export subsidy removal and subsidies for agriculture. The big part of the blue bar was due to the tariff reforms, improved access to the EU, to US, and other places. This is what was included in the Doha Development Agenda, the orange. When we arrived in Geneva, Helen and I met with the chairman of the negotiating committee in agriculture and the WTO, and he said, oh, finally, we've been working so hard. We have an agreement. We're going to get rid of export subsidies. We could do a little bit on domestic support. We'll leave tariffs for next time. That was too sensitive. Well, it turns out that is what was the main benefit for development, for poverty reduction, the tariffs, improved market access. So when we delivered these results, I still remember him leaving the building. He was so discouraged. I felt very badly about that. But that's the way, that's what they negotiated, and those are the implications. And that leads to my key lesson number 3. Having data, models, tools available for everyone to use now makes it much more difficult to conclude some of these trade agreements. Transparency doesn't make the job easier for the trade negotiator who goes to Geneva and wants to then go back to the national capital and say, oh, we negotiated hard, but fortunately we don't have to do anything. That was the goal of most of these trade negotiators, to somehow get something from the others, but not to do anything. And when you don't do anything, you don't get much in the way of results. And this transparency, no doubt, made the Doha Development Agenda one reason why it hasn't yet been concluded. And it's difficult to negotiate when everyone can see what's going on. When you can go to South Africa and assure them that this economic partnership is going to be a great benefit to you, and we're not going to maybe do anything too politically sensitive in Europe, but it'll be a great benefit to South Africa. Well, when they can run the same analysis, maybe it's tougher. Tougher negotiations are tougher. I want to go beyond trade policy. Luca alluded to some of my current work and interests, and this relates to sustainability. And we take as the starting point for this the Global Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. Really important goals, aspirational goals, but in each of these categories are many particular targets. And the ones I'm focusing on are the ones that somehow involve land and water resources, okay? I'm interested in those and the competition between these different objectives. You may push for zero hunger, but that may lead to land expansion into natural lands or degraded water quality, for example. So there are trade-offs. It's a challenge to achieve these. I want to walk through just a couple of examples. The one that really got me deeply into environmental issues was biofuels. So you all may recall that there was at one time a biofuel boom, okay? It turned out in one small period between 2006 and 2008, half of the global increase in cereals use, now to everyone around the world, 7 billion people, 6 at the time, less than 7 billion, but around the world increasing consumption, that was only equal to the increase in biofuel demand for those cereals in the US. So just this one activity, this one mandate generating so much increase in cereals that it matched all of the rest across the rest of the world. You can imagine what that did for markets. Prices went up. There were a lot of dramatic consequences. But why did those policies, why were they invented to begin with? Well, there was analysis done. We talked about Science Magazine. Ethanol can contribute to energy and environmental goals, plus increased farm incomes. Win, win, win. 3 wins, 3 politically important issues at the time, chalked up as wins. So this very good people doing the work, but they weren't economists and they didn't look beyond, they didn't look at the market effects. So they were counting on all these things happening. We legislated an important biofuel mandate in the US that led to this huge increase in demand for cereals. What happens then? Well, prices go up. Prices go up, and you have these market effects. Boosted prices encourages more land conversion, increased production elsewhere, and we get something that's called indirect land use change. Land use change induced by a policy here spilling over to land use elsewhere. And to the extent that increased almost corn and soybeans going to ethanol and biodiesel production in the U.S. stimulated Brazil to increase their production. Well, we know the sensitivity, environmental sensitivity in Brazil when it comes to the agriculture-environment interface. That's a kind of indirect land use change that resulted in actually use of U.S. croplands for biofuels increases greenhouse gas emissions. So went from a win-win-win to something else, and also published in Science. So this led to our team at Purdue, also working closely with Wally Tyner and Farzan Tahiripur, getting involved in this exercise. And this led to the development of something called GTAP Bio. It was a model with biofuels fleshed out and all of those features, those policies incorporated. So that's been the story with GTAP. As new problems have arisen, tweak it, add a module, modify it to address the new issue. The group in the US leading the way in terms of taking this indirect land use change seriously was the California Air Resources Board. So California, as we know, is a huge economy, would be probably the 5th largest economy in the world if it stood alone. And the Air Resources Board had very great success in improving air quality. Yeah, that's why it's the Air Resources Board in California. And very strict scientific protocols. So first of all, like a building with like 1,000 people, a lot of engineers, a lot of scientists. Anything used by the California Air Resources Board, any model used, has to sit on a computer in Sacramento, has to be open for anyone in the public to come and run, and has to be, they're strict, has to have been peer reviewed and so on. Very strict standards, and they've been very successful in this regard in making, environmental policy. California Air Resources Board comprises 8 or 10 people, scientists and other leaders, and they make these decisions based on scientific input. So we were contacted not because we were the ones who did this analysis. This analysis was done with something called the FAPRI model. It was done at Iowa State University. But it turns out that model couldn't be run on a computer in Sacramento, California, because the model was really a bunch of models and the expert people putting it together and doing what was very sophisticated analysis, but it wasn't publicly available. So they came to us because we had been doing this work on greenhouse gas emissions, land use change, and whatnot, in that case for the Environmental Protection Agency. And we had a modeling framework that could be used for that. And so GTAP Bio was the model. And so they first asked me to come out and just present on this GTAP Bio model and get a feel, is this something they could use? Is it credible? And I talked about how this was being used in trade policy analysis. For example, every trade agreement the US gets involved in, they need to do a GTAP run to analyze that, any of these trade agreements. So it's been ensconced in trade policy for a time. Perhaps they could achieve something similar at CARB for this. And so they decided to go ahead with it. We did this analysis that's featured over here, actually, published in 2010 in Bioscience, of the proposed of the indirect land use impacts of the corn ethanol mandate in the U.S. Had to present that then at, I was telling Luca and his team this morning about that experience, presenting in California, Sacramento, up here sitting like the Supreme Court, these members of the California Air Resources Board. I was presenting this analysis, and behind me were 99 people from the public, because everyone can present. You just take the 2 hours and divide by however many people there were, so they each had like 2 minutes to present. But everyone from the oil companies to people from the Amazon to all kinds of NGOs presenting. And in the end, they voted to go ahead with this modeling approach for addressing the indirect land use change. It was subsequently, I put variance here because it's been subsequently greatly improved by work by Wally Tyner, Farzan Tahiripur, and others, and it continues to be used for regulatory analysis. So this is an area where It started out perhaps not being the best model for the job, but because it was publicly available, because people were using it, because there was this continuing, demand, challenging improvement, funding for improvements, it's become kind of a gold standard in this area for addressing indirect land use change. So that's an interesting example, and I just conclude from that two things. First of all, it's not always the best model that's used for evidence-based policy analysis. Rather, it's the model that's available to the public and be most readily used. Second lesson from this, and it comes from this experience and several others I've had, economists don't understand how to communicate their findings to the broader public in general. Our goal is to publish, as Luca was saying, say in the American Economic Review, those papers take a long time to come out and they don't have the same visibility as a paper coming out in Science, where I know the reporters from the New York Times, for example, they're all over each issue of Science, and as soon as it comes out, there may be one of my experiences publishing in one of those journals. We published, we submitted the work in December, and by April it was not only peer reviewed and came out, but it was a half page in the New York Times on that work, and that was some of the work on biofuels actually that we did, biofuels and climate. These scientists, they know how to communicate, they know how to get their stuff out, they have their media teed up, and we have, as economists, have far too little influence on a lot of these debates. That's probably was the problem with the initial biofuels question. The work was done in the science journals, published there. Economists didn't engage until later on, really until it was almost too late. All the investments have been made, the ethanol plants have been built, very hard to undo that. So I think we need to think much more about this. I only learned from a bunch of young climate scientists I was working with how to publish in these journals, and I found it very rewarding. But we need more. More opportunity for grad students to learn about that, and postdocs, and of course for faculty as well. My last topic is global to local to global sustainability analysis. So as I've gotten into sustainability questions, I realize that all sustainability questions are local, okay? Because fundamentally, I'm talking about land and water resources. You think about water and groundwater in the US, the regulation, the governance of that varies by state, it even varies by county. So first of all, the governance. Secondly, the weather varies. Thirdly, the aquifers that you're drawing on, the activities done, in that above ground that are drawing on that one. Sustainability analyses are local. If we go to think about Amazon, for example, we were talking about that this morning in our session. It depends on where you are. Are you at the edge of the Amazon biome where you're talking about competition, or is it somewhere else that's already been developed? That land use change will have very different impacts. So all sustainability analysis is local, and most of it you see published is very local. That falls prey to a very important limitation. They don't know what the global context is. So one of the early collaborators I've had is the head of agronomy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he had just finished a 5-year NSF study of sustainability in the central Wisconsin area where they live. They're very, very vulnerable to water quality degradation and whatnot because the soil's very sandy. So they were studying this alternative future as well. What if everything was green? That is nature-based. Or what if we farm the whole thing? But it wasn't related to the actual conditions, the global environment, the global context. Local sustainability analysis without the global context falls prey to, you don't really know where the world's going. How can you know what the pressures are going to be on that local community? So you have to have the local context, you need the global drivers, and you also need to think about how, if everyone does this with biofuels, for example, how does that feed back to the global markets? So my raison d'etre now is global to local to global. I think that's the key to analyzing sustainability. I'm going to give you one example and then wrap up. And this is one that got a lot of visibility. The publication that we produced, The Economic Case for Nature, came out of the World Bank last year in the summer. And it's the collaboration now between GTAP and another network, the Natural Capital Network. Natural Capital Network is based at Stanford with a lot of collaboration from the University of Minnesota. NatCap is largely ecologists, and they work on global issues from an ecology point of view. Okay, what is nitrogen use around the world, and how much of that is going into degrading water quality? What if we reconfigured that? Or they worry about loss of pollinators, natural pollinators, for example. They have 20 different ecosystem models. The idea behind this work, and something I'll talk to you about in a moment, GlassNet, is to bring together these networks. So GTAP's a powerful network on its own, but what if you brought it together with other people, with another global network that's also very effective, and looked at those issues together? So what we've done here is to combine the GTAP framework with their INVEST modeling suites. These are ecosystem service models operating at a very local level. So it starts out with the GTAP painting the picture for the evolution of the economy, in this case to 2030, okay? Economic growth, population, structural change puts pressure on, in this case, land and water resources. So it may degrade some of the land and water resources. It may cause us to infringe on natural lands. And that degrades ecosystem services that are being provided, in this case, pollination, marine fisheries, timber provision, carbon, and that feeds back to the economy. So the question is, when you follow this circle around, what is the economic case for nature? How big are the impacts from these degraded ecosystem services, the economic impacts? So from the World Bank point of view, they're very interested. The environmental economists there want to be in the room with the finance minister. They want to be saying, environment's important, you need to listen to us because it's going to matter for the economy. So this is just a snapshot of results. These are pollinator impacts. This is running out to 2030. What are the impacts on, for example, degraded services, natural pollinators, which are very important for certain crops in agriculture, forestry impacts, and fisheries. So here you see, red is degradation, blue is positive, and this is the welfare impacts by income categories. These are the low-income countries, middle income, high income in the world. And the interesting thing, and the sad thing, and the important thing is that it's the poorest regions that suffer most from the degradation of ecosystem services. Why? Because they're most reliant on sectors like agriculture that are often and fisheries, very ecosystem dependent. The good news is that policy responses can improve outcomes. So we were working closely with the World Bank. They wanted to get into solutions and policies. We looked at things like repurposing agricultural subsidies, national payments for for ecosystem services, a global scheme of payments for ecosystem services where the rich countries transfer the money to do that, so repurposing subsidies to R&D, and a combination of policies. So you can see that these are gains relative to business as usual. Business as usual resulted in degradation. Now these policies relative to the business as usual generate gains. And we can look at those on a kind of a trade-off between environment. This is natural land protected, and this is billions of global GDP, dollars in global GDP. And you can see kind of a configuration here, but there's kind of a sweet spot up there where you take those agricultural subsidies, repurpose them for public R&D on agriculture, and combine that with a global payment for ecosystem services policy. So that was an interesting and I think quite influential study. Subsequently, Justin Johnson, the lead on that, has been contacted by so many consultancies and corporations because they're being required increasingly to pay attention to their impact on biodiversity. So there's a lot of private sector interest in this right now. We'll see how far that goes, how deep it goes. But we certainly are wanting to continue that. The Lesson number 6, and the last lesson, Luca, is that evidence-based policy analysis related to the sustainability challenges, I believe, is most effective when couched in a global framework. Because, you know, obviously the common criticism of ecologists when they look at economic models is, well, you've aggregated everything up. So here we're taking the evidence at whatever level they can provide it, integrating that into the analysis, but we're also tying it into the interests of the Minister of Finance, who's worried about GDP or the whole economy. So this is my last slide. I wanted to draw your attention to, this is kind of my next passion, if you will. It is a network of networks, and up here you can see the networks involved. Okay, GTAP is one of the 10 networks you see up there. There's also the Natural Capital Project, ecologists. There's the Global Land Program, that's a network of geographers. The Quasi is a network of hydrologists. And so our goal, and this is the, you can go here to this GeoHub, and it's not just a website, but it actually, you can run models there, you can upload data, you can compare results. It's designed to be a vehicle to facilitate this collaboration in global analysis of sustainability issues, local global analysis of sustainability issues. And yeah, it's kind of an overarching umbrella that allows and encourages the GTAP network members to begin to interact across disciplines, achieve some of these successes that we were able to show in that World Bank report. So that's the end of the talk, Luca. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Really an inspiring lecture and very clear also for those like me who are not so familiar with the GTAP circuit. I must say I'm really impressed on how your perspective of work is aligned not only with the work the Manlio Rossi-Doria Center is carrying on in recent times, but especially with the work of Manlio Rossi-Doria himself, especially when you talk to us about institutional innovation and capacity building. Manlio Rossi-Doria, who worked basically the first half or first 70 years in southern Italy. So he was very much concerned about these two issues. So although Luca already said in advance that we would have found so many connections in your research, with that of Rossi-Doria, it's really astonishing to me. So thanks again to you. It's time for questions from the floor. So I hope there are questions ready. And please, when you raise your hand, tell your name and institution, and we are ready to receive questions. Yes, please. Would you like to come here? So maybe it's more easy to...
Be sure to introduce yourself.
I will, definitely. Do you want me to? Okay, I will. Okay. Well, first of all, I have to say I'm very happy to see Professor. I'm a Purdue alumni myself, and I moved to Rome last year. I'm an economist at FAO now. And yeah, first of all, it's a great lecture. That's super interesting. I guess my first question is related to the global framework. So I guess it reminds me, first of all, the notion from physics that small system is within larger system, and this systematic interaction can generate something you cannot just aggregate. But on the defense of economists, I guess sometimes aggregation does simplify the question, right? And I think in some questions, aggregation gives you a clear picture already. And this framework might add complexity exponentially. So my question is, where do you think this applies the most value added in the analysis? And yeah.
Why don't we stick with that, and you can ask the other one, other 3 or 4 questions after. But.
I'm running out of my questions.
I want to respond to that first, because that was a super question, and I think very relevant. So interesting that you raised the question of physics, because I got this idea really from the climate scientists. So the climate scientists first of all, I have huge respect for what they've done on a very difficult problem. And in some ways, their models are a lot like our CGE models. They have these columns, and like our agents are sectors, and those interact with one another vertically and horizontally, and determine things like sea surface temperature. And so what they have done now, because of the tremendous complexity of these models at the global scale, they run their global models first, and then they dictate boundary conditions. So these are sea surface temperature to regional models, and the regional models may be for the US or maybe for the Midwest or something. So again, global, local. I'm not sure whether they've really gotten to the point of the feedback yet, but they're working on very tough problems. But those regional models are very valuable, but they're not useful without the global model. And I think something similar applies here. I think you obviously need the global framework, but for some of these sustainability issues, they are very much local in nature. The way we've been addressing this question is actually we're not using for a lot of the really local analysis, we're using a partial equilibrium model called SIMPLE, a Simplified International Model of Prices, Land Use, and Environment. So we sacrifice the economy-wide coverage to get the local resolution. So to have a model like GTAP at the fine scale, we're talking our analysis now being done at the grid cell, 5 arc minutes, there are millions of those around the world. You couldn't put those together. So you need to compromise. So, but excellent questions, and I think they're right on the money about this.
Yeah, and I have a second question.
Okay, you really should sit down.
So this goes back to your first lesson message.
Yeah.
So one thing we at FAO do is we offer evidence-based policy analysis for developing countries in particular. And one challenge we face is sometimes you have a relatively unstable institution.
Yeah.
And because what you mentioned about the academia continuity, I think that's a major advantage in conducting analysis. But then on the other side, you do have some instability in especially developing countries. You change the administration, they have a different preference, they have a different agenda, and we face major challenge there. So I guess I wonder what's your...
That's a really excellent point. So I would like to differentiate between a network of institutions, FAO, working with a university or a government or a research institute in some developing country, and a network of individuals. So the beautiful thing about this, so GTAP, the main power of GTAP comes from the network of individuals. They're the ones who contribute data. They're the ones who work on improving the model and developing new approaches. The institution provide guidance, but the work is done. So the good thing about networks is, okay, so that university melts down, or that research institution, it's in the middle of civil war, it's destroyed. The people go somewhere. You follow, those people stay involved, and they may go somewhere and get other people involved. I have this story I love to tell about the beginning of GTAP, which was really hard. It looks great now. It must have been like snap your fingers and this thing blossoms, but it was really hard to convince people of this early on. And I finally got USDA, as one government agency in the US, involved in doing a lot of work on this. And there was one person there that was kind of key to this. And when I heard he was applying for a job somewhere else, I thought, oh no, here we go again. Well, he went to the WTO, largely on the strength of the work he'd been doing with GTAP. They hired him there because he knew so much about trade policy. WTO got involved, he got other people there involved, the USDA stayed involved. The network of individuals you keep is powerful because you're following the individual, not the institution, which can go up and down. So I think build a network, FAO should be thinking about building a network of scientists working on these issues, as well as you need the institution. Obviously, you're relating to the government and the policies, but there's power, so much power in a network of individuals. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, and thanks for organizing this.
Thank you to you. So this is a good news not only for developing countries, but at least to a little extent also for Italy, which faces a certain degree of instability. More questions?
How about from the students? I met some very interesting students before the seminar. There's Martina over there, for example, who are studying international governance. There's a group here studying development and resources, environment. Any questions from you? Or questions about careers? What are you going to do in the future?
So in order to give a little bit more time for them to think about their questions, I have a small one myself. That is, I was somehow surprised not to find any ideas of extending research when you told us the efforts of the network of going beyond GDP analysis. So you talked about poverty and then sustainability and so on. I was somehow surprised not to hear anything about food security, which is much related, of course, with trade, with climate change and sustainable issues. So is there anything boiling in the pot?
Yeah, absolutely. I had the good fortune of actually chairing one of the scientific subcommittees for the UN Food System Summit, which was all about food security. And we focused on resilience, so writing recommendations and reports eventually for the Director General of the UN, but also interacting a lot with the public, and we were thinking a lot about food security in that context. One point that I wanted to keep making, though, was that fundamentally, poverty is the underlying issue. You may provide enough food for people, but what about healthcare? What about education? It's not just about the food, and so ultimately, getting enough income in people's pockets so they can make the choice, I think, is very important. It's important to think back to deeper than just food security is the poverty problem, and but food security is super important. And in this other framework, simple, that's one of our main metrics is food security and how that distribution of caloric intake varies and changes over time with income, with prices, and income distribution and whatnot. So we are doing a lot of work on that. Luca was tough about keeping the talk short. Not telling you about everything I've done, but you're right. Food security is super important, especially now. We have this decline, steady decline in food insecure people, and it's been rising really since before COVID, and now strongly with COVID. So it's a real problem, and I think also evidence of underlying poverty and income distribution issues. So yes, food security is super important. Yeah.
And if I may shortly reply, of course, poverty is one of the drivers of food security problems. However, I think maybe I'm not an expert in the field. However, I think market access is also important, and market disruptions are increasing in frequencies according both to climate change but also political instability, and probably probably market access issues are also to be considered. You were talking about going more in depth into labor market. Yes. Again, related to poverty, but also accessing the market for small farmers is important. That's right. Beside labor issues, the capability of small and very small farmers to access market where to sell their products. So right. on both sides, demand and supply, market access, I think would be probably worth exploring.
Absolutely, and that, you know, that was evidenced in that one finding from the poverty study about the price transmission to rural areas, the fact that, in a sense, they don't have access to the world markets, or at least not those prices, and it's all about, for them, all about integration into markets. Yeah, no, very good points. Thank you.
I think that for your career, you interacted, you had the chance to interact with a lot of policymakers at even high level. So what is the insight? What should we do to communicate better with these people our results? Because sometimes we have a problem of language and messages. We tell things that they don't care about, and we perhaps don't live up to the expectation they have. Any further ideas about that?
We certainly need to communicate better, especially as economists. We need to communicate our results in multiple. I think any good paper you write, you publish in an economics journal, there's something of a companion paper that needs to be written for a more popular audience, whatever it is. It could be even for other disciplines, could be for policymakers, and that's something we should be doing with our students, Luca, that they should also, during their grad studies or postdoc, have an experience writing one of those papers, because otherwise you get to a later stage in your career and you realize, wow, that's important, but I don't know how to do it. So it is a different set of skills. Working with communications people is valuable. Learning how to present your results in a concise way is important. But personally, I have found my comparative advantage is to train students and also work with policy advisors, give them the capacity so they can do the communication. There are two sides to that. One, that may not be my comparative advantage, but two, it's always more compelling if that message is coming from, as I said, someone down the hall from you, someone from your country, someone who you know and trust and work with. So I think it's very important to help those people who are very close to the policymakers to get the right message across, to give them the tools to help them make that communication, because ultimately the policymakers aren't going to be listening to me, they're going to be listening to people closer to them. So that's why I put such an emphasis on capacity building. But clearly communicating our messages clearly, sometimes they get picked up and read, and that's really important. And certainly the other way around, the first thing we did with GlassNet was to set up a stakeholder advisory board, because we often don't know what the important issues are, what the policy deliberations are going to be about. So we end up spending a lot of time doing research on something that's of interest to us intellectually, but maybe is not important from a policy point of view. So I think that engagement, stakeholder engagement, I've come to believe that was really important. That World Bank Poverty Project, they insisted on giving like several $100,000 more to the project just for dissemination. I thought, come on, I could fly there or something, but they were right. The value added from that project, and actually the way we ended up writing it up, was totally changed when we got out and started interacting with stakeholders, whether it was Maputo, Mozambique, or Geneva, or Brussels. What was important changed in our mind. Things that seemed obvious to us were earth-shattering, say, in the case of Brussels in that one instance. And so I think more engagement with policymakers is really important, and those people who insisted that we devote a huge part of my sabbatical, a huge part of the funding, I wasn't just traveling alone, I was traveling with a half dozen people who had done those studies, who from Brazil, from Indonesia, from these countries, delivering their message. And they learned also in this, I think, so that kind of, well, I'm sure that's the kind of thing that your center really emphasizes, and I think it is very important. We need to do more of it.
Thanks. Any more questions?
There aren't. I still use this opportunity. So, talking about now the other side, not the results, but the input, the data. And there is a quote that I don't know if it was originally from Rossi-Doria, but I like to think it's real, that model results are like sausages, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah,
So all these nice features of the models, then if the data are not available, they are not there. I remember that a colleague of ours once saw the GTAP model, say, it seems written according to a textbook of last century. No game theory, no imperfect competition, no fancy features, but then of course, it's rather easy to write complex equations, but if you don't have the data, it's useless. So what do you think is the situation? Because there are some great databases that are available now, which is good news also for the youngest researchers, but then we face day by day a lot of difficulties, as I mentioned to you this morning, in terms of access to the data, because national institutions sometimes also on behalf of good principles like privacy, they are very strict about this. How do you see this problem?
There are like three things I'd like to respond to. They're all very interesting. Let me start with the disciplinary perspective. So people do game theory with GTAP. They generate payoff matrices and then do very elaborate games with that, for example, as one interesting application. Industrial organization, we've written papers over the, many papers over the last few decades with industrial organization in their various kinds of market imperfections and interesting features. You have to be able to specify that. It matters entirely, how those firms are interacting. So you need to build that knowledge in. But the tools are there, even on the website. Those kinds of models exist, and it's a question of back to the data and parameterization. So the GTAP model was written down not to be a sophisticated model. It was written down in order to know what data we needed, what data and parameters. Because if you develop a database without a model, you always find you're missing something. It structures your thinking. So it was designed to be a model that just structures our thinking, a generic global general equilibrium model that shows you all of the things you need to have a fully specified model. And interestingly, on the data quality front, the great thing about this consortium is we always try to find the best person in the world to deliver that particular data. So the tariff data, we started out with this guy at USDA copying numbers out of the WTO country studies. This is why the WTO hired him. He knew more about their country studies than they knew. We then moved up, we upgraded to dealing with, something that that actually UNCTAD had put together for us, and then WTO. Now we work directly with the people who gather the tariffs in the countries. The International Trade Center Geneva has people all over the world gathering the tariff information. We work with them closely. They know what we need, and they provide that in a format. So it's actually quite complex. Tariffs aren't just tariffs. You've got specific tariffs. You've got tariff rate quotas. You've got all kinds of things going on there. To get the data right, just the policies right, is very elaborate. And we try to work our way up that food chain to find the source. And once you do, you try to cultivate that relationship and work with them. And that's been very effective. So for providing a database that then people can go off and do whatever they want. There are hundreds of GTAP-type models, okay? And they can emphasize different things. So we encourage people, this is a starting point, but build on your interests. And the nice thing is you started with this model, and then I developed some theory that results in this particular equation about labor markets or, industrial organization. That's the equation I parameterize and put in the model and develop new insights. That's the way we envision it. This isn't the end point. This is the starting point for people improving the data for their country or improving the theory. I think that's the way to think about it. Luca, I don't know whether I answered everything, but you brought a lot of things to mind, not surprisingly.
I think that it's a word of hope for the future, so I think it's a nice ending.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Or any more questions?
Good.
Thank you so much,
yeah.
Thomas. Grazie a tutti. Thanks everybody for sharing this time with us, and hope to see you at the 26th lesson of the Rossi-Doria Center. We really hope.
Thank you. Really lovely, sweet introduction.
I had the highest expectation and I wasn't disappointed.
Yeah, I think I was able to keep it short. I looked at the time.
Very effective. Then I will have some feedback about the message went through.
Excellent. Yeah.